Greetings and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Kais. Thank you for listening. And as usual, you can listen to God Save the King every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. On the Truth Be Told Radio Network, there are a variety of ways you can listen to the Truth Be Told Radio Network. This, of course, includes going directly to the Truth Be Told Radio Network website, which is www.truthbetoldnetwork.org. Go straight to their website and click on the big listen button. You can listen live at 10 p.m. Eastern to listen to my show. Plus, you can go there and listen to a lot of other great shows pretty much 24/7. Now, there are a variety of other ways you can listen to God Save the King. We are now available not only in, through a variety of applications on your smart devices, which means your phone or your Google, Apple, and Alexa, Echo home devices, but that includes your phone, of course. Your phone is a smart device. Lots of different applications, such as your Android app, the MyTuner app, the Wi-Fi radio, TuneIn Radio. These are all applications you can use to listen to God Save the King on TBTRN. But we are also available now as a podcast. So if you go to Anchor, you can find us there, plus on Amazon, Spotify, and a bunch of other places that you can find us in podcast form. So we're really thrilled to have you listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. A little bit of business here. As usual, the opinions expressed on God Save the King are not always the same as the opinions of the Truth Be Told Radio Network itself. So if you've listened to me before, you know by now that God Save the King is my ongoing 30-plus year biblical, historical, and scientific research project devoted to retelling the Nativity the way it really would have happened. And that is because the traditional Nativity story is, in fact, Christian mythology and bears only the vaguest resemblance to, again, what really would have happened. So open your ears, open your mind, open your Bibles. Maybe the Nativity doesn't look quite like we think it does. So last week was my first week back after a couple of weeks off, and we did a little bit of a memorial to my older brother, Dan. And my older brother, Dan, was a playwright and a theologian in his own right, a Bible teacher. And he actually was commissioned to do a series of dramatic productions about the life and ministry of Jesus Christ, starting back in the mid-1980s, which is when we were introduced to the hypothesis that Jesus was not born on December 25th. And as a result, he had this idea to tell the nativity story through the eyes of different biblical characters to try to spice it up, frankly, because back then we didn't realize that changing the date radically changes how the story looks. And we also didn't realize that, frankly, the traditional nativity story has a lot of problems with it, just in its own right, let alone if and when you change the date. But the combination of those two things, changing the date and taking a really good critical look at the fable that got passed down for so long, makes us realize that, it didn't really quite look like that. So once again, God Save the King is a research project where we use the Bible as our primary source. I mean, I put the historical background in to be sure, but really we are using the Bible as the primary source. I do believe that the Bible is the revealed word of God and it's inspired, and therefore it is going to be correct in the long run. Now, that's not blind faith. I diligently research everything I find in the Bible with secular research, and I haven't found a contradiction yet. And that reminds me, I forget where I got the quote. I'll have to look it up and share it with you another time. But there is a quote out there by a very famous archaeologist, can't remember who it is off the top of my head, who said that, every time we dig up something significant archaeologically in the Bible lands, it doesn't contradict the Bible. That hasn't happened yet. That only happens when you have an agenda of someone trying and hoping and wishing and trying to contradict the Bible. But when you have what's the word I want? Objective research going on. We have yet to contradict the Bible. Very, very interesting there. So, but we paid homage to my brother Dan because he was instrumental in getting God Save the King off the ground. He was initially doing it as a dramatic production project. I turned it into a biblical research and teaching project. His initial idea was to tell the story or retell the story through the eyes of the shepherds or through the eyes of the Magi or through the eyes of Herod the Great. And then over time, as I discovered how much of the story is different than we really understand, I took those three perspectives and modified them a little bit. And the way I look at it now is from three different perspectives, but I call those the Judean Chronicle, the Parthian Chronicle, and the Roman Chronicle. And they're not entirely exclusive. Of course, they are going to overlap to a large degree. The Judean Chronicle is primarily about Joseph and Mary and their background, okay, and their journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem and the birth of the Messiah. But it also includes Herod the Great and the house of Hasmon, the Hasmoneans or the Maccabees. That plays a crucial role. But of course, Herod overlaps into the Roman Chronicle because he was administrating Judea as a client king for the Romans. So that means we have some really big names in Roman history that actually play a very significant role in the nativity story, such as Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, Cleopatra. Now, Cleopatra, you're going to say, well, Cleopatra was Egyptian. Well, no, she wasn't. Cleopatra is actually Greek. She wasn't Egyptian. She didn't have any Egyptian blood in her. She was a Macedonian Greek descended from the Ptolemies that inherited Egypt after the breakup of Alexander the Great's empire. But I include her in the Roman Chronicle because she consorted with Julius Caesar first, and then the Roman general Mark Antony, and they play a significant role in the backstory with regard to Herod the Great. So that's the Roman Chronicle, and then the Parthian Chronicle is predominantly the Magi, but there's also the Parthian government is plays a significant role here, plus the concept of trade comes into the picture, the trade routes, the international trade routes at that time, because the international trade routes went through Parthia, all right? And the Parthians taxed everything that went through their territory. So that played a significant role in how both national and international things, happened at that time. So prior to the memorial to my brother Dan, we were looking at the historical background of the Magi, and we had pretty much gotten up to the Greek era. Now, let me do a quick overview. As a matter of fact, I'm going to take the opportunity here and see if I can't screen share with you here. That is my intention. Let me see if I can get this map up here on the screen for you guys to look at. Here we go. And okay. Yes, no. Okay, so I guess, Oh, great. I guess I'm going to have to go back and see if that works. Nope. Okay. Looks like I have to go back and change my settings again. God darn it. I changed my OS on my computer a couple of weeks ago, and I was unable to screen share because of that. And I've got to go into my system preferences and change it in order to be able to screen share with you. So you get the benefit of just listening to me talk. So here we go. So, quick review of what we've covered up until now. Now, one of these components is extremely important, so that's why we're going to review it, which is that we now know that there has been in existence in Mesopotamia a classification of scholarly celestial observer in Mesopotamia going back something in the neighborhood of 3 millennia, not 3 centuries, 3 millennia, 3,000 years. For 3,000 years prior to our story, prior to the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, there has existed in Mesopotamia scholarly celestial observation. And this plays a significant role in Mesopotamian culture, in Mesopotamian religion, and in Mesopotamian politics. Now, the various empires of Mesopotamia came and went, but the essential function of these Mesopotamian astronomers and astrologers remained the same for about 3,000 years. Now, there was some progress. They learned some additional things. And then, especially as we get very close to the time of the Nativity, there were some pretty significant changes due to the influence of the Greeks and things like that. But like I said, very important to remember that a class of scholarly celestial observer existed in Mesopotamia for at least 3,000 years prior to our story. And yet, by the time of our story, we know that Matthew, when he's writing his record of the visit of the wise men from the east to the court of Herod the Great, he says, and there came wise men, Magoi, the Greek word there, Magoi, magus is the singular, Magoi is plural, magus is singular, and we anglicize that and say Magi today. So, but he gives virtually no explanation of who these wise men are. So therefore, according to the rules of biblical interpretation, we have to assume that he assumed that his audience at that day and time understood who these men were. Okay. And so that is the question that we are investigating here in depth. So once again, this class of scholarly celestial observer has existed in Mesopotamia for at least 3,000 years up to this point. And by the time of the Gospels, Matthew writes, and wise men from the east, Magoi, Magi, visited Herod and said, "Where is he who was born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in its rising." Okay, so that just raises all kinds of questions about who were these guys and how did they know what to look for and what did they see and all these questions. And then, like I said, also by this time, Matthew is treating them in a very objective fashion that his readers know who these guys are. So who were they, right? So fast forward about 1,500 years, start at 3000 BC, and then fast forward to roughly 1500 BC. It's more like 1650. You have the reign of the Babylonian king Amisaduqa, and at the time of the Babylonian king Amisaduqa, we have a clay tablet. Okay, and this clay tablet is currently on display in the British Museum in London. It's known as the Venus Tablet of Amisaduqa, but it is a catalog of the heliacal risings of the planet Venus for that era of time. That's how we can tell when it is from, is because we can wind the clock backwards, so to speak, and look at when the heliacal risings match up with the dates given in the tablet. So therefore we know when the tablet was recorded, right? So once again, now you have pretty darn hard evidence of the existence of a highly educated scholarly class of celestial observer 1,500 years before the birth of Christ. So then we fast forward again and we get to a good jumping off point is the Assyrian and the Babylonian captivities, right? We know that the Assyrians, which were the dominant empire in Upper Mesopotamia, they conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, because now the kingdom is split, right? You've got the divided kingdom. You've got the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judea. The Assyrians swoop in and they capture the northern kingdom, and then roughly 100 years later, the the Babylonians, who have conquered the Assyrians. They come through the area and they conquer the southern kingdom, right? So this is significant in the history of the Magi, because it's unquestionable that you had Magi, or what we would call Magi. You had this class of celestial observer in the royal court at Nineveh, which was the capital of the Assyrian Empire, but that's in northern Mesopotamia. But we also know that you had this class of celestial observer at the royal court in Babylon, which is in southern Mesopotamia. So the existence of this class of celestial observer is simply not arguable. And the fact that they were astronomers and astrologers, they were celestial observers, that cannot be argued. I know there's a lot of people that try to say that. They try to say, oh, no, they weren't astronomers. Yes, they were. Yes, they were. Oh, no, they weren't astrologers. Yes, they were. We have tens of thousands of clay tablets that we have recovered from what we would call the Middle East, from the royal libraries at Nineveh and the royal library at Sippar, which was south of Babylon, plus many other libraries in the area. And the vast majority of these clay tablets record astrological omens. That is what they record. This was their job, which is really interesting, because this is a kind of reverse engineering. See, because we don't have like these historical texts that we wish we had. It would be great if we had historical texts from a third-party observer who's on the outside looking in and examining the Magi objectively and telling us, oh, this is who they are, and this is what they believed, and this is what they knew, and this is what they understood, et cetera, et cetera. But we don't have that. But what we do have is we have the writings of the Magi themselves, but it is predominantly on these clay tablets that they recorded during the morning and the evening observation. The morning observation would be when it was dark until the sun came up, and then the evening observation would be from the sun went down until it was dark. And then, by candlelight or lamplight, they would take a leather hard clay tablet, and they would, using a stylus, a triangular stylus, and cuneiform text, they would record what they saw. And we have tens of thousands of these clay tablets recording what they saw, and then also recording the omens that they believed were demonstrated by these celestial observations. And so once more, this goes back at least 3,000 years. By 1500 BC, we've got a very accurate catalog of the heliacal risings of the planet Venus during the reign of King Amisaduqa of Babylon. And then by the time you get to roughly 600 BC, which is the time of the Babylonian captivity of the southern kingdom of Judah, we know that Daniel and his friends get taken captive. They get taken to Babylon, and they are being trained to function in the royal court as wise men. And how do we know this? We know this because Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and he goes to his wise men and says, hey, if you can't interpret my dream, then off with your heads. And Daniel and his friends fall in that same category. So that means that is what they were being trained at. And so then Daniel, of course, we know, interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and then Nebuchadnezzar appoints him the Rabmag, which is the chief of the Magi. Okay. And by this time, there was a tribe that was a part of the Median Empire, okay, which was simply called the Magians. And apparently they must have played a significant role in this class of celestial observer, because right around this time is when they start to be referred to as the Magi, right? So in the Babylonian court, the Magi served this dual religious and political role. Actually, it's religious, political, and educational role. They were court officials. They were court tutors. They read stars. They interpreted dreams. They oversaw royal succession. and they gave a daily intelligence briefing to the king, because that's the other thing that was included in these cuneiform tablets is these daily intelligence briefings. So we know that's what they did. We know that's what they did at the royal court at Nineveh. We know that's what they did at the royal court at Babylon. Okay, so fast forward, you have the Babylonian Empire being conquered by the Medo-Persian Empire. The Magi retain essentially the same role, but under the Persians, the Persian Empire is the empire that officially adopted Zoroastrianism as their their official religion. But once again, very important to remember that this type of celestial observation far predated Zoroaster by a long time, and certainly Zoroastrianism by a long time. So it stands to reason that this type of celestial observation influenced Zoroastrianism as much as Zoroastrianism influenced this type of celestial observation. Okay. So now, fast forward again, you have the Greeks who conquered the Persians. Now, under the Greeks, things changed. And in a previous episode, we talked about the fact that because of the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities, you now have a significant Jewish population living outside of the Promised Land, living outside of Canaan or Judea, right? You have a significant Jewish population in Babylon. And when Cyrus of Persia made a declaration allowing the Jews to return home and rebuild their temple, we know that it was only a very small portion of the Jewish captives in Babylon that actually chose to return to the Promised Land and rebuild the temple. Very interesting. That means the majority of them were very comfortable in Babylon and chose not to leave. So one of the things we covered in a previous episode began to talk about is the fact that when the Greeks come in and they conquer that entire area, I mean, Alexander ruled over one of the largest empires ever in the history of the world, extending all the way from the Greek peninsula itself through Asia Minor, through the Near East, through the Middle East, through Iraq, Iran, and then what we would call Afghanistan, all the way to the Indus River in what we would call India. So it's this enormous empire that Alexander rules over. So under Alexander, you had the practice of Hellenism. Hellenism was Alexander's world vision to make all the world Greek. He wanted to see a unified empire. He wanted to see a unified kingdom with a unified language and religion and philosophy and all of that. So the interesting thing is, under the influence of Hellenism, under the Greeks, it was the Jews outside of the Promised Land that actually had a much easier time dealing with this. It was the Jews within the Promised Land that were treated very harshly by their Greek overlords, demanding that the Jews adopt Hellenism. And this created all kinds of problems. We're not going to focus on it today. Once again, common thing that I say on this show is that we will cover it in another show. We will mention it briefly today, which is when the Greek Empire starts to disintegrate. The tiny kingdom of Judea manages to declare its independence and break away from the Greeks. And there's good reason for that, because they were extremely harshly treated by their Greek overlords. And that plays a significant role in our story. But we are talking primarily about the Magi. Who were they? Where did they come from? What did they know? How did they know to look for this sign that apparently appeared in the stars? So now you've got this Jewish population in Babylon, but under Greek hegemony, right? And very interesting, once again, we'll talk about this at another show. The Magi recorded the celestial events that occurred during the time of Alexander's conquest of Babylon. So we can learn and understand quite a bit about what the Magi knew and believed by looking at the omens regarding Alexander the Great, because he came in and they were like, "Oh, what did the star say? Was there something we missed?" And on the day he entered, what did they say? And were there omens about Alexander? And they had to interpret them and understand what happened, celestially around the time of Alexander the Great. But under the Greeks, we have to ask ourselves the question, well, then what happened to the Magi precisely? Okay, because as we mentioned, under the Babylonians, they were a largely unified body of court officials, right? Celestial observation, dream interpretation, royal succession, right? And then royal tutors, royal advisors, things like that. Then under the Persians, same thing, right? Essentially a unified body, okay, of court officials, court tutors, court advisors, royal advisors, celestial observation, dream interpretation, etc., etc. But now you have the Greeks. So what happens to the Magi? Because what we can't say with any high degree of certainty that under the Greeks, the Magi were still a unified body of court official, because that's not what the records say. What appears more likely to be the case is that while they certainly retained a loose affiliation, because if that's who you were, if you belong to that class of scholar, then you belong to that class of scholar. And you were an educated man and a wise man. And that meant you were valuable not only in the royal court of Alexander himself, and then in the courts of Alexander's generals, right? They would have been welcome in any royal city, any governmental, what's the word I want to use? County seat, right? What if you had satrapies, which is provinces, basically, whatever that provincial capital was, whoever the ruler was there, the governor there, he would have Magi on his staff, so to speak. He would have advisors on his staff. So under the Greeks, and also we know under the Greeks that they traveled. This is very significant. We know that the Magi started to travel, that the Magi they would travel to cities throughout the Greek Empire to serve there. And then also we know that the Greeks began to send their best and brightest to the east to study with the Magi, right? So we know really beyond a shadow of a doubt that there would have been Magi in the court at Babylon. There still would have been Magi at Nineveh. There probably would have been Magi at Haran and Rasapha and Carchemish, certainly at Antioch. No question about that. There was probably Magi at Damascus. There was certainly Magi at Pergamum, probably even at Ephesus, right? Possibly even on Rhodes. Certainly Magi at Alexandria in Egypt. Now, a little side note here, Alexander founded several cities that he named Alexandria, right? And the furthest one to the east that we're aware of is Alexandria in what we would call, now we would call it Afghanistan, and that's Kandahar. Kandahar is a derivation of the title Alexander. That's Alexandria, Afghanistan. So there would have been Magi there as well. So it's very interesting to note that the Magi took on a slightly different role in that they were not necessarily a unified body at this point. They were scattered all over the place. And then also, like I said, we know that the Greeks, and this goes with the concept of Hellenism, because this was one of the challenges, is that if you were Alexander and or one of his successors and you wanted to enforce Hellenism throughout the empire, then you needed leadership who understood Hellenism. And sure, they would get converts. I mean, there would be undoubtedly there would be converts from different ethnicities that would adopt Hellenism, that they would help promote Hellenism. I mean, that certainly happened in, in the Promised Land. That's one of the things we will see, is that this became a very significant political notion, which is that among the Jews, there were those that embraced the foreign policy, right, of the Greek overlords and said, yeah, we'll play along, okay, fine, we'll play along, right? But then there were those who didn't. I mean, remember that the Jews who left Babylon after the decree of Cyrus the Great, the whole plan was for them to go back to Judea and rebuild the temple. So that means these are religious zealots. These are patriots. They want to go back there. They understand their identity. They want to rebuild the temple and worship Yahweh the way they understand the Torah tells them to. So when the Greeks come in and say, yeah, you got to do what we say, and we're going to Hellenize you. You got to speak Greek. You have to follow Greek religion and Greek, all that kind of stuff. That did not go over well. We're going to go into that more in depth in a different episode. But yeah, that created a real problem. And then in addition was the problem between the Jews who said, okay, I'll play along. And then the Jews who said, no, I won't. No. Don't think so. Don't think I'm going to be sacrificing a pig today. Thank you very much. All right. So to repeat my point, under the Greeks, you've got the Magi largely disseminated, for lack of a better word. They are scattered throughout what used to be the empire of Alexander the Great, in all these different cities in these different regions. And then you have the Greeks sending their best and their brightest to the east to either do one or two things, which is to either help enforce Hellenism, to be one of the leaders there, or to frankly learn from the Magi, right? And here's a name that everyone will recognize from, at least junior high school geometry, which is that the Greek mathematician Pythagoras traveled to the east to study with the Magi. We know for a fact that happened. So this is the role of the Magi under the Greeks. Now, so the next thing that happens, right, we said, is that Alexander dies, and and they divide up his empire. His generals divide up his empire. At first, it's 5 generals. Then one of them is quickly defeated. So then it becomes 4 generals. And then 2 of those generals control Greece proper, right? Macedonia, Thrace, etc. And then one controls Asia Minor. And then the 2 that are most significant to our story are Ptolemy in Egypt, and then Seleucus, who has the Levant and the Middle East and all the way to India. Okay. Now, this is very significant because they immediately go to war over Judea. Now, why do they go to war over Judea? Well, let's take a little bit of a detour here, and then we'll be back in a minute. But let's take a little detour here, because one of the things I want to talk to you about is some of the trade routes that existed in the area, because they actually play a pretty significant role on our story. Okay. So long before we get to the contemporary story, so long before we get to the first few centuries BC, going back as far as 800 BC or earlier, what you had sea trade that would go along the coast from the Indian subcontinent up to the Gulf, what we would now call the Persian Gulf, and they would cross over, and then they would follow the shoreline of what is now the Arabian Peninsula all the way around to the city of what we would call Aden, right? And then the Gulf of Aden, Okay. And so all they would do is follow the coast. That's all they had to do. It didn't require long sea voyages and stuff like that as far as like going out over open sea. They would just follow the coast, and they would go up and down the coast all the way from the Indian subcontinent to the Persian Gulf and then around the Arabian Peninsula to Aden, right? Now, once they got to Aden, that is where they would offload, okay? And then from Aden, products that would come from India, which is primarily things like tea, spices, and incense and things like that, that would be popular in other parts of the world, especially in Mesopotamia or in Egypt or in Rome, right? Okay. They would travel by caravan, by dromedary caravan, camels, right? Dromedary caravan from Aden to Petra. And then once they hit Petra, they would pick up what was known as the King's Highway, because the King's Highway was a part of this trade route that traveled all the way from Egypt all the way up to Rasafa in Mesopotamia, right? And it was called the King's Highway because it went through the capitals of several different kingdoms. It went through the capital of, so to speak, the capital of Egypt, so to speak, and then through the capitals of Edom, Moab, and Ammon, and then up into Mesopotamia through Damascus, and then to Rasafa. And then at Rasafa, that was when it would hit the trade routes that would go to southern Mesopotamia to the east, to the southeast, and then into Asia Minor and Europe by going to the northwest. Okay. So that was the predominant trade route, starting around 800 BC. Okay. Sea trade, India, Saudi Arabia, offloaded Aden by dromedary camel to Petra, pick up the King's Highway, and then they would go through the Levant to Rasafa, and then from Rasafa to Mesopotamia or Asia Minor. Okay. So that meant that the Levant, Canaan, was a very significant crossroads for the trade routes. And this is borne out all through the Old Testament. I mean, just off the top of my head, it occurred to me that, when Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, right? That's because you had traders traveling from Egypt up through the Promised Land, up through Canaan, probably headed towards at least Damascus, if not Antioch or Rasafa, to trade, right? See, so that's and that's much earlier, but it just demonstrates the fact that these trade routes existed, right? So now when Alexander founds the city of Alexandria in Egypt, that makes Alexandria this great jumping off point for the Mediterranean basin. So the products would travel from Aden to Petra and then Alexandria by caravan, but then they'd get put on a ship and they'd get sent all through the Mediterranean from that point. So it is incumbent upon the empires of that time that they really want to control the trade. Really, really, really significant. Very, very important. Okay. With what's going on here. And as I said, it doesn't seem related at the moment, but it is, because the trade routes were also the standard routes that you would travel by. So when we say that the Magi traveled to other parts of the region, and that the Greeks would send their best and their brightest to the east to travel with the Magi, they would follow these same routes, right? We sometimes get this tunnel vision that we think travel back in ancient times, that people would just strike out across country and just go as the crow flies, which is no, they traveled back then the same way we travel now, which is you traveled on existing roads, you traveled on existing routes that were established by other people, because that was your best way to stay safe. It was your best way to find food and water. That would be how you would travel. Now, in addition to this, and this is a really fun part of our story, that a lot of people don't recognize, which is that roughly around 200 BC, and this is where I wish I had my map. Sorry, guys. Promise next time I will make sure I can screen share before I turn on the recorder here so you can look at a map and talk about this. And that is roughly around 200 BC, okay? Jade was discovered in what would now be Western China, okay? Now, what we would refer to as China back then, what would geographically be China back then, was much smaller than what we call China today. China would have been much smaller, and it would have been a chunk of what we would refer to as Eastern China. Western China wasn't China at the time, right? And this corresponds to essentially the rule of the Han Dynasty in China, essentially, right? Rough equivalence there. So jade was discovered in, I got to try to pronounce it correctly. It should be Xinjiang, the Xinjiang province of China, which is far western China, right near what would be the let me see, I take a look here. It would be right in modern terms, it would be near the Kyrgyzstan, Afghanistan, Pakistan border. That's what it would be near now, that far west, right? But jade was discovered there, and jade was highly prized in China proper, the Eastern China, right? So around 175 BC, the nomads that lived in that area of really what is Central Asia, that's Central Asia, the nomads of Xinjiang, right, which is also known later as Sogdiana. Sogdiana was the name of the Greek name under Alexander, right? So some of you might recognize that. It's the same region. But nomads from that area began trading with China, and they would trade jade, which was highly prized in the Chinese courts, and they would trade jade for things that were very important to them, but especially for tea. They wanted the tea that the Chinese grew, right? And then if you fast forward a little bit further, you get to about 140, roughly about 140 BC. The Chinese emperor sends an ambassador to this area because he wants to learn more. He wants to potentially increase trade. But really what he's after is he's trying to propose an alliance with some of the nomads in that region against other quote unquote nomads in that region. And the two predominant parties, in addition to the Chinese, that are involved in this are the Yuzhai, right? The Yuzhai, and then the Xiongnu, right? So the emperor sends this ambassador, Zhang Chen, to the Yuzhai to try to get them into an alliance against the Xiongnu, right? Now, the irony is that the Yuzhai take Zhang Chen captive for like 12 or 13 years. And then when he finally comes back, he reports to the emperor that they've got these amazing horses in that region that they didn't have in China. So this opened up trade around 120 BC between the Chinese capital of Xi'an, okay, and then the predominant city of the Xinjiang. Man, this is rough. I got to practice this more. The Xinjiang capital of basically which is known as Kashgar, right? It's one of the westernmost cities in China, but it opens up trade basically from Eastern China to Western China. And here you go. Everybody's going to recognize this when I say it. What also that means is the emperor, for the first time ever, because he wants these special horses, for the first time ever, the emperor agrees to trade silk. And therefore, this trade route from Eastern China to Western China begins to be known for trading silk. Now, it's not called the Silk Road yet. The phrase Silk Road actually doesn't happen until the 19th century, but this is why. This is the incident that precipitates all this, is that the emperor decides he is willing to trade silk for these horses. Okay, now back to the other part of our story here, which is that the Greeks control, after Alexander, they control everything from the Greek peninsula through Asia Minor, through the Levant, through the Middle East, all the way to India. But then over the next several hundred years, this all begins to disintegrate because they do not have the power to maintain Hellenism throughout their entire realm, right? And frankly, you've got provisional governors and things like that are, pardon me, I said that wrong. Not provisional, provincial, okay? Provincial governors who are in charge of certain regions, and they start going, you know what, I don't care. I mean, I'm going to operate independently. You can figure out what to do in your area, but I'm responsible over here. I'm going to do what I want, right? And they want to protect trade, and all this kind of stuff is extremely important to them. Money is going to be at the top of the list, right? So the Greek Empire, though, starts to disintegrate, right? There's infighting between the different regions. You've got pressure from Rome up and coming on the west, starts pushing eastward from the west and starts, making inroads into Seleucid Empire. And then you also have these conquered territories starting to break away and declare their independence. Okay. So one of the earliest was a province. Here we go. I want my map again. On the southeast corner of the Caspian Sea, in what would now be northeastern Iran, there was a province called Parthia. Okay. And the Parthians broke away and declared their independence from the Greeks. Okay. It was basically roughly 247 BC. An Iranian nobleman and governor for Seleucid Parthia named Andragonus. Andragonus declared independence, but then he was only, independent for a few years rather, when he was killed in battle with the forces of a man named Arsaces the First. He was the leader of the Parni tribe, and the Shah, okay, which is just the Parthian word for king, or the Persian word for king. He was the Shah of Parthia, okay? But this inaugurated what is known as the Arsacid dynasty of what would become the Parthian Empire. Arsaces I continued in open revolt against the Seleucid, inspiring other provinces to do the same. And over the next 100 years, the Parthian Empire would move steadily westward, carving out chunks of Seleucid land. Okay, so by the middle of the 2nd century BC, due to this internal strife and the conquest of the Parthians from the east and the conquest of the Romans from the west, even the tiny little kingdom of Judea could revolt against the Seleucids and declare their independence. So this happens in the middle of the 2nd century BC, that the kingdom of Judea declares its independence, and Judea will actually be an independent kingdom from roughly the middle of the 2nd century BC to the middle of the 1st century BC. But take note, like I said, there was this province at the southeast corner of the Caspian Sea that breaks away, okay, and moves steadily westward for the next couple of 100 years, frankly, as the Seleucids disintegrate, and frankly, until they bump into Rome, is really what it boils down to, right? But take note that the Parthians also, for lack of a better word, tried to move to the east, right? But if they were to move to the east from the location that I am describing, which I said is northeastern Iran, a little bit of Western Turkmenistan, right? That means that if they try to move to the east, they're going to run right into the territory that I mentioned earlier, which is make sure I at least try to pronounce it correctly. Where'd my document go? That they're going to run right smack into the Ujai. Okay, they're going to run right smack into the Ujai, right? And it isn't until I think it's roughly about off the top of my head. I'm trying to remember exactly when this is, because what happens is that like I said, is you've got trade has opened up between Eastern China and Western China, between the Chinese and the Ujai, right? But you don't have significant trade between the Ujai and the Parthians just yet. You're going to, but that's because the Parthians want to tax everything that comes through there. But what we're talking about here is you're talking about the opening of the Silk Road, of what we would know today as a Silk Road, which would be an all overland trade route going all the way from China through Central Asia, going from Chang'an to Kashgar to Samarkand, and then to Ctesiphon, and then to Antioch, right? So this is this magnificent trade route that is going all the way across Asia, because you got to remember, this is the known world of the time. Europe is the land of the barbarians, right? Africa is the land of other barbarians. This is the civilized world at that time, is the Levant, the Middle East, Central Asia, and China. So what this means, okay, now, is that with the resurgence of the Parthians, culturally, they're going to go back to something much more like the role of the Magi under the Babylonians and the Persians. It's not going to be exactly the same, but because they start, like I said, they start on the southeast corner of the Caspian Sea, and then they move to the west, which means they retake Mesopotamia from the Greeks. So once again, you've got a Mesopotamian culture, or a near Mesopotamian culture, occupying that land. Now, like I said, they're from Parthia, which is northeastern Iran, which isn't Mesopotamia itself, but they've only got to go to the southwest several hundred miles, and they're in Mesopotamia. Okay, so they're going to retake Mesopotamia. They're going to establish their capital at a place called Ctesiphon, and then they're going to retake all of Mesopotamia, southern and northern Mesopotamia, and that's when they run into the Romans later on. That creates all kinds of problems in Upper Mesopotamia. Is the wars between the Parthians and then what we would call the Armenians, and then the Romans, and there's lots of intrigue there, because the Romans tried to get the Parthians to join them against the Armenians, and just all kinds of fun stuff going on there. But also, in the background is this whole thing about these trade routes, right? Because you used to have to go by ship from India up the coast, around the coast to Aden, and then by camel from Aden to Petra, and then Petra to either Alexandria, and then by ship, or Petra, up the either the King's Highway or the what's the word? They call it the Way of the Sea. It's the inland route that would go up through Judea proper, right, to like Antioch, and then up into Asia Minor, and then off to what we would call Europe. So that's some of the background behind what's going on here. Is, you've got these trade routes setting the tone for what's going on. So this brings us to the point, and it sets up perfectly for next time, which is going to be, what is the role of the Magi in the Parthian Empire? Because the Parthian Empire is in full control of that region. Now, they had some, we'll talk about this. The Parthians had some give and take in northern Mesopotamia. They won some battles, they lost some battles between them and the Romans and the Armenians, determining, who controlled what parts of northern Mesopotamia at what time. So there's definitely some back and forth at that time. But in southern Mesopotamia, in Ctesiphon and in Babylon and things like that, they were in firm control there. So you would have had a body of Magi at the Babylonian court or at Ctesiphon, which was their capital, in full control of that part of the empire, right? So the Magi are back in business. So so this is next time. This is to set us up for next time. What were the Magi like under the Parthians from basically the middle of the 2nd century to the middle of the 1st century and beyond? Because then it's the second half of the 1st century BC is when we would have had very deliberate interaction between the Parthians and not just the Romans, but the Hasmoneans and Herod administrating Judea on behalf of the Romans. So this is a very, very, very interesting period of time, is the second half of the 1st century BC, because you've got a very unstable period of time in northern Mesopotamia, so that could spill over into Judea very easily. But you've also got well-established trade routes from India through the Arabian Peninsula to Petra and Alexandria, and then by ship to the Mediterranean basin. But then now you've also got the possibility of an entirely overland route going all the way from Antioch to China. So what do you do with that? Okay, so how do the Magi fit into this, and what's going on, and the wars and the rumors of wars and the intrigue and who marries who and who kills who and who murders who? And that is why we call this show God Save the King, because there is all this political intrigue going on between these different nations and different empires as to who is going to be in charge and who is going to be in control and who wins and who gets the girl and who gets the money and all that kind of stuff. So this is why God Save the King is such an exciting project to work on, is because I learn something new pretty much every day about these different pieces of the puzzle and how this affects the nativity story. Because like I said, we're now in the second half of the 1st century BC, working up to the point where we are going to discover the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. And these wise men from the east, the Magi, they arrive at the court of Herod the Great. Herod would number one, he would have known they were coming, at least by a couple of days' notice, and he would have known who they were. This was not a surprise. It was not 3 wise guys on camels. He would have known. So I got to wrap it up there because we are running out of time. Again, my name is Tim Keyes. I am the host of God Save the King. You can listen to God Save the King every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. We'll see you next time. God Save the King.